Hello, and welcome to today's episode of Thinking Deliberately. This is episode 3. It's about dynamic intelligence and why being clever isn't enough. In episode 1, I suggested that the way you think may be the problem. In episode 2, I suggested that you are not fixed a self waiting to be discovered, but a self being constructed in the moment. Today, I want to talk about intelligence. And I want to begin by saying something that clever people may find irritating. Being clever isn't enough. In fact, being clever can be a developmental problem. Clever people are often very good at explaining themselves. They can justify quickly and they can argue elegantly and eloquently. They can defend their position with impressive vocabulary, but they can make their limitations sound sophisticated. But cleverness does not necessarily create awareness. Sometimes it protects us from it. A clever person can build a beautiful argument around an unconscious reaction. They can explain why they were right, why they had no choice, or why the other person misunderstood them, and sometimes why the situation demanded their response, and why anyone who disagrees simply has not understood the complexity. And underneath all of that intelligence, the same old construction remains untouched. And that's not development. That is a well-decorated cage. This is why constructive development theory needs a different kind of intelligence. I call it dynamic intelligence. It's not about how much you know. It's not IQ, and it's not really about academic achievement. It's definitely not about emotional fluency or leadership charisma. It's not about being articulate in meetings. Dynamic intelligence is the capacity to become aware of how you are constructing yourself, your context, and your response in the moment, and to use that awareness to choose differently. The key phrase is in the moment, not 3 hours later, which I cover in the dynamic intelligence awareness model, not in the shower the next day or on the drive home or at midnight when you suddenly realize what you should have said, not after you have already sent the email, damaged the relationship, shut down the conversation, or repeated the pattern you swore you had outgrown. That is reflection. And reflection is useful. It's used all the time in some development programs, especially in organizations. But dynamic intelligence is more immediate than reflection. It's an awareness arriving early enough to affect the response. And it's the moment you feel yourself becoming defensive and notice it before it speaks. It's the moment you realize your need to be right is about to take over the conversation. Maybe it's the moment you notice that you are constructing disagreement as disrespect. And it is the moment you catch the old version of yourself trying to rebuild itself in a new situation. That's a bit of disequilibrium right there. And that's where development happens. It's not in the theory, in the moment of construction. Most people are not short of information. They know loads of stuff. But have they read books? Yeah. And have they watched videos? Of course. They have attended courses. They know words like trauma, attachment, mindset, values, purpose, leadership, resilience, narcissism, which we hear too much of these days, empathy, and sometimes authenticity. And then someone challenges them in a meeting and suddenly they become a wounded child with a management title. And that is the problem. Knowledge does not guarantee awareness. Insight does not guarantee choice. Education does not guarantee development. And cleverness does not guarantee wisdom. Dynamic intelligence asks a more uncomfortable question. What can you notice while you are constructing your response? Because if you cannot notice the construction, you are likely to become it. You become the anger, the defense, the certainty. You become the wounded identity or the role that you're trying to protect. And then afterwards, you call it honesty. Well, I was just being honest. No, sometimes you were just being unconsciously out loud. Honesty without awareness can simply be reaction with a moral costume on. And this is why dynamic intelligence matters. It creates the possibility of choice. Without awareness, choice is mostly fantasy. People love to say, I choose to respond that way. But often what they mean is, my reaction happened and I agreed with it afterwards. That's not choice. That is retrospective approval or a post hoc rationalization. Choice requires awareness before the response hardens. And dynamic intelligence is the capacity to generate that awareness when it matters. And this is why I think we have misunderstood intelligence for far too long. We admire people who can think quickly, but quick thinking is not necessarily better thinking. Sometimes quick thinking is just fast habit. Sometimes it is old fear moving at speed, and sometimes it's ego with a better vocabulary. Maybe it's certainty arriving before awareness has had time to get dressed. So the question is not simply how fast can you think? The question is how aware are you of the thinking that is happening? And that is a different order of intelligence. And it matters everywhere, really. In leadership, a person can be strategic, confident, experienced, and highly articulate, and still construct the world through ego, control, fear, image, and unexamined certainty. And that is dangerous, not because they're stupid, but because their intelligence is not sufficiently aware of itself. In coaching, a coach can listen beautifully, ask elegant questions, and still be constructing the conversation through their own need to rescue, advise, impress, or just to be liked or to be seen as wise. The session may look developmental, but underneath, it's still being shaped by the coach's unconscious intention. In relationships, two people can be having entirely different conversations while using the same words. One constructs feedback as criticism, the other constructs silence as punishment. One constructs disagreement as rejection, other constructs emotion as manipulation. They both insist they are responding to reality, but we know they're not. They are responding to the reality they have constructed. Dynamic intelligence allows us to interrupt that process, not perfectly and not necessarily permanently, but enough to change the next response. And the next response is everything, because development is not proven by what you understand. It is proven by what becomes available to you under pressure. Anyone can sound wise when they are calm. Anyone can describe awareness when nothing is at stake. Anyone can talk about growth while sitting comfortably with a coffee and a notebook. But what happens when your identity is threatened? What happens when you are criticized or when someone questions your competence? What happens when your partner says the thing that you hate hearing? What happens when your child pushes exactly the button you pretend you don't have? And what happens when the world does not confirm the self you are trying to be? That is where we find out how dynamically intelligent we are. Not in our explanations, in our response. Dynamic intelligence is awareness becoming choice under live conditions. It is the mind catching itself before it becomes behavior. And it's the difference between being driven by your construction and participating in its formation. That is why being clever is not enough. Cleverness can help you solve problems. Dynamic intelligence asks whether the way you are constructing the problem is part of the problem. Cleverness can help you win arguments. Dynamic intelligence may notice that needing to win is exactly the construction keeping you underdeveloped. Cleverness can help you build a successful life. Dynamic intelligence asks whether the self that built that life is now trapped inside it. And that is where this becomes personal, because many people are not trapped by failure. They are trapped by the version of themselves that helped them succeed. The clever one, the responsible one, the strong one, the expert, rescuer, performer, maybe an achiever, a rebel, a victim, the leader, and the one who always knows. These selves can be useful, but if you cannot see them as constructions, they become prisons. Dynamic intelligence gives you a way out, not by rejecting the self, but by becoming aware of it as a construction. And once you can see the construction, you can begin to choose your participation in it. That is the start of freedom. Not total freedom, not fantasy freedom, not the childish idea that we can become anything we want by repeating affirmations into a mirror. Real freedom is smaller, sharper, and more demanding. It is the moment where awareness appears and gives you a gap. And even if it's a tiny gap between intention and response, between construction and behavior, and between the self you were about to become and the self you are now aware enough to construct. That gap is where dynamic intelligence lives. And if you develop it, everything changes. Not because life becomes easier, but because you become less automatic, less captured by old constructions, less owned by your reactions, less seduced by your own cleverness. So here is the question for this episode. When pressure arrives, what happens to your intelligence? Does it expand into awareness or collapse into habit? Do you become more curious or merely more certain? Do you construct choice or defend identity? because that is where we find out how intelligent we really are. Not when we are explaining ourselves beautifully, but in the moment where awareness arrives, either it does or it does not. This is the thinking deliberately. And today's uncomfortable thought is this: you may be clever enough to explain your life, but are you dynamically intelligent enough to change your next response? Thank you. See you on the next one.